Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For the free tutorial here on YouTube today, I'd like to share you a bracelet or necklace end connector. Let's head down to the board, take a closer look at the project, and then we can knock out a couple of variations together. So what do I mean by a bracelet or necklace end connector? Well, these things are really useful little doohickeys to have, and you'd pop your beading thread through one of those apertures, and then you've got the other aperture into which you can connect your chosen clasp, or whatever it is you're going to use to connect the two ends of your project together. But what happens if you don't have one of those handy, or you don't have one in the right coloured wire? So I'm going to show you two different ways in which you can connect the ends of your necklaces and bracelets, which you've created using beading thread or tiger tail, and I'll show you two different ways that you can work on that. Here are some real examples. So on one end of this piece I've just added a very simple no bead connector, and on the other end I've added a beaded connector. So I'm going to show you how to make one of those. Let's pop this out of the way for a second. So I have an example of a bracelet that I've quickly put together, and there's simply on one end a loop of my beading material with a crimp and a crimp bead cover just in position. So what we're going to do is to add in a bead, and we're also going to create a nice solid connector in metal into which our clasp of choice will be able to connect easily. So I'm working with 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and I have around about a 5-inch scrap length from my desk. Just going to give that a very quick warm through to get going. Now I'm going to make two connections, and one is going to be really small and it's going to go through the end of my bracelet. One of the other reasons that you might want to use one of these is because the chosen bracelet you've created isn't quite long enough for the wrist just to simply have a clasp attaching one end to the other. So you can use these with much larger beads, as I have here, to extend the length of your bracelet without having to remake it. So I've grabbed my memory wire finishing pliers, and I'm going to create the small loop on one end of my 5-inch length of wire. And you can see that I've left a little bit of a gap in there, so it's really easy for me to add into that loop created. Now what I tend to do with these is just close that up by hand and then grip across that circular form with my chain nose pliers. So let's turn this around the core wire. And if you struggle with the fingertip strength, or you don't particularly want to have your fingers covered in scratches, you may like to employ a second pair of those chain nose pliers to help you finish off that little bit of rotating. So you can see I've got 1.5 turns already. So I'm just going to very softly open and close my pliers as I move it. It tends to allow better control of that end section of wire. Once I've finished with those 3 little coils, I'm going to move my pliers softly over the surface of that coil. Now I'm not trying to tighten up the coil in any way. I'm just really smoothing over the cut end of the wire so that it then becomes safe to wear. So we've connected into the end of our bracelet, which, as I say, you could be making longer, or you could simply want a better connection point. So let's give that a quick smooth through. Hopefully the bead I've chosen from my stash will work. Happy days, that has worked indeed. What we need to do now is to create another bend on the other end of that piece of core wire, and ideally the distance between the bead and the bend should be the same on both ends of that little connector. So this time, because I want to connect in my lobster clasp from the other end, I'm going to make a slightly larger round form. So let's grab those memory wire finishing pliers, start rotating around. Let's finish that off with a slightly larger loop. Now if for any reason that doesn't sit equally and symmetrically on the end, you can adjust that position by very gently moving your wire with your chain nose pliers. And then we're going to do the exact same thing as we did on the first side, and just rotate those two ends around. Now if you struggle with making the estimation, I estimated that we would have either 2.5 or 3 wraps on either end. If you struggle with that, then give yourself a little extra wire. Bring the point at which you make that right angle bend in a little bit further to the centre of your wire, and then you'll have two sides which have a piece of wire coming away from them, and in that way you can better estimate, or you can exactly measure how that will look in its finished position. So do be careful when you're working with beaded connectors that you don't accidentally smash them, and again you can rotate those pliers around in the direction that the wire is moving just to get that nice smooth finish. Now before you create this second loop, if I show you the other end of my bracelet, I created a second loop here, but what I'm going to do before I start wrapping that around is open my loop up, and I'm going to drop in my clasp of choice. So let's just pick this small, simple silver lobster or parrot claw clasp, however it is known locally to you. Slide that down into position. Now to begin with, I'm going to support across that loop we've just created, making sure that I don't crush the delicate piece of the clasp, and start drawing that around. And again, if you position your bead in the very centre of your 5-inch length of wire, you may well find that you can get a slightly better judgment on having equal numbers of wraps on either side of your bead. So if you struggle with guesstimation, then do that instead. Let's trim this away. And then you'll be able to just take half a turn at a time to make sure that you don't get unequal distances. I think I need to nibble just a tiny bit more away of that wire. I'm just going to put my thumb over the top because I value my camera, not because I don't value my thumb, just to stop it from pinging up into the camera again. It happened once, it was expensive. I'm not going to let it happen again. So let's close that up neatly. And then you've got a slightly elongated and professionally finished bracelet. So I'm going to show you now a slightly fancier way of creating a connector to enlarge your bracelet or necklace, or indeed just to connect the very end to your chosen clasp. So before we get stuck into the fancy embellished necklace and bracelet end connector, I thought I'd show you what I mean about centralising your bead on one of these connectors. So you've got your circular forms on either end of the wire. This again was around about 5 inches of wire for a relatively small bead. I'm going to start by wrapping around one of those ends, get a couple of turns in, make sure that they're super neat and tidy and that you're happy with them. Flip that over to the other side. Obviously, if you've got a clasp in one side and your bracelet in the other side, you'll need to be sure that you're not putting any pressure on those items. So let's say this is the smaller loop. I just need to make that a bit tinier. There we go. And then I'm going to rotate around that core wire a couple of times until we get the same number of visible wraps on this side. And again, you can go a lot slower. You can take care to make sure that your coils are lovely and neat. Let's take one more over on this side and tighten that up slightly, and then we can assess the situation. So they look similar at the moment, so what I would do is I'd go 1/2 a turn on one side, make sure it's nice and neat and tidy. Unlike that, there we go. Flip it over and do a 1/2 turn on the other side and make very small adjustments until you've actually filled that whole central core. So I think I can probably get at least a 1/4 turn on both sides. So if I flip that over, if I draw the wire upwards, that's a 1/4 turn. Turn it in the opposite direction, flip the wire upwards, that's a 1/4 turn. So I think by the time I've trimmed that wire away, that's 1 and 2. What we're going to do is to support that core, support the loop, and then just tighten up those end pieces little by little using that same technique of rotating the pliers around. We're not trying to shrink the loop on the end, we're trying to soften that cut end of wire. So that needs a little bit of work to get it neat and tidy. Let's rotate that around in the correct direction. And then if you have mangled the core wire in any way, shape or form, you can take a second just to make sure that that meets your expectations and your requirements. And in that way, you'll end up with a much more balanced connector than kind of starting at one end and hoping for the best. So for the last segment in today's video tutorial, I'm going to show you a slightly fancier beaded wrapped version that can be used as a connector for ends of necklaces and bracelets. This one's actually really cute and you could use it to add very simple charms to earring findings. Let's head down to the board and finish off today's tutorial. I'm again working with 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and I have started off with around about 7 inches and a relatively small bead. I just wanted to be able to show you this in a nice and simplistic way. So I've already started with my wrapped loop at one end with a little bit of wire sticking out on the end, just until I know what kind of size I'm looking to create. So let's flip this over into the other direction. And we're going to estimate where we want the bend of wire to occur. So if I just push that away from me for now, then we'll grab in our round nose pliers, or you can use your memory wire finishing pliers or your multi-step bail makers, whatever makes you happy. So we've gone for a slightly larger loop on this end because I want to be able to add this in to a clasp of my choice. Let's make sure that that's nice and straight so my bead isn't under any stress. I'm going to give that a little bit of a strengthening as it's in my hand right now, and then I will commence by wrapping a couple of times around that core wire and tighten up those coils while I have the opportunity to do so. So again, you'll see that I've got a little bit of work to do, so I might take this round one more time whilst it's in my dominant hand ready to go, flip it into the opposite direction and do the same thing again. Let's take that all the way around, and I think by the time I've brought this one back over the top, that should be relatively equal. So let's just make sure that's nice and neat and tidy before we trim away the short end. Make sure that you're happy with how that is sitting and that the dimensions look good and that you have indeed tidied it up neatly. So I think by the time I have, whoops, there goes the scrap pot, trimmed away the short end and popped that in the pile of broken wire now on my desk instead of the scrap pot. Let's just make sure that that nice end section is lovely and smooth and sits down against the core wire. So we have basically the same as we did with our first connector, just like so. But what we're going to do now is use the Galatea rings technique just to add a little bit more detail to the design. So the tail of wire that is long and still connected is coming over the top of my design. So I'm going to make sure that that's nice and warm, drag it around the side of the bead to the underneath on the far side, where I'm going to loop that all the way around at least once. Make sure that that's as taut as you can get it, nice and neatly and tidily. And then we're going to flip around. You can see now that my wire is underneath the design. So what I want to do is to bring that around the edge of the bead and over the top of the design. You could even just trim away after going for that one side, but I'm going to show you that double wrap. It's a really nice little connector. So as long as you take that around one time, and I'm going to make it just the one time because then it will look the same on both ends. I'm going to trim that last little section away. I know that it's good and safe because we've gone all the way around more than once, just 1 and a bit times. And then I'm going to squish down that last little sticky uppy bit so that my connector is now nice and neat and tidy and ready to be used. So you can see that it encircles that bead with a nice little haloing effect. Well, I hope that you found today's video tutorial to be of some use in your jewellery making, and I also hope that you have a really lovely day. Do take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.